My name is Caroline, and I'm 33 years old. I had only been home from the military hospital with my newborn twins for 2 days when my husband walked into our kitchen with his wealthy boss draped all over him. He tossed a stack of divorce papers onto the granite countertop, smirked, and told me to sign them, claiming that she was carrying his true heir. My mother-in-law screamed at me to get out of the house and throw myself into the freezing winter night. But they had no idea that the unemployed veteran they were throwing onto the street had secretly bought the very company they worked for. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground against family members who underestimated you, hit that like button and subscribe. My body was still completely numb from an emergency C-section. I stood at the threshold of the house whose mortgage I had been secretly paying for 3 years, clutching the heavy infant carrier with my babies inside. A brutal winter wind whistled behind me, biting at my ankles, but the emotional cold inside the house was far more devastating. My husband, Bradley, stood nonchalantly by the kitchen island. He didn't glance at his children. He didn't rush over to help me bring them inside or ask how I was recovering. Instead, he was busy pouring an expensive glass of champagne for 42-year-old Meredith, the VP of Vanguard Tech and Bradley's boss. Her manicured hand was resting intimately on his chest, her fingers tracing the lapel of his tailored suit with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. I shifted the heavy carrier, and even that tiny movement sent sharp, agonizing pain through the surgical staples in my abdomen. I had expected him to be shocked. I thought he'd jump back, scrambling for some weak excuse as to why another woman was in our home. Instead, Bradley just took a slow, calculated sip of champagne, reached into his leather briefcase, and threw those legal documents onto the island. "Just sign them," he said, his voice void of any emotion. "I'm done playing house. Meredith is carrying my real heir. I'm finished pretending to be a philanthropist, supporting a washed-up veteran who needs my medical insurance just to afford fertility treatments." I stared at the divorce papers, his harsh words echoing in the pristine kitchen. He called the beautiful twins I had struggled so hard to bring into this world test tube mistakes. He called me a charity case. He erased 10 years of marriage with a single sentence, standing next to a woman he had clearly been seeing for months, while I was suffering through the complications of a high-risk pregnancy. Meredith stepped forward, smoothing out her designer cashmere coat. She looked at my practical winter boots and my exhausted pale face with pure disdain. She leaned against the marble countertop, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "He needs a woman who understands corporate strategy, Caroline," Meredith sneered, swirling her glass. "He needs someone who can navigate a boardroom and manage multi-million-dollar accounts, not someone who spent her 20s playing war games in the desert and her 30s unemployed, living off her spouse. You've been holding him back for years, and he's finally seen the reality." Her words were meant to cut deep, to establish her absolute dominance. For the last 5 years, ever since I retired from the military's logistics and intelligence division, Bradley and his social circle had assumed I was just a struggling veteran. I let them believe I lived off a meager disability pension, spending my days baking cookies and watching daytime television. Bradley loved complaining to his friends about how he had to carry the family's financial burden on his middle management salary. He loved playing the victim. He loved the control that role gave him. He thrived on feeling superior to a woman who, in every measurable way, was far more capable than he was. What Bradley didn't know, what nobody in that house knew, was that my laptop wasn't for searching recipes or clipping coupons. During my service, I had built a massive intelligence and logistics network. After retiring, I founded Aegis Global, a cybersecurity and defense supply chain firm that had just surpassed $1 billion valuation. I wasn't unemployed. I was the secret CEO of a business empire. My security clearance required me to maintain a very low profile, which was the only reason I let the house and cars stay registered in Bradley's name. But watching them stand there, radiating an arrogance they hadn't earned, I remained expressionless. I didn't shed a single tear. Military training teaches you how to isolate trauma, assess threats, and strike only when your enemy exposes their weakest flank. Let them feel powerful, let them dig their own graves. Before I could respond to Meredith's pathetic insult, heavy footsteps thundered from the second floor. My mother-in-law, Brenda, came stomping down the mahogany staircase, dragging 2 large, bulging black trash bags that were ripping at the seams. Brenda slammed them down the stairs. The bags exploded on the hardwood at my feet, spilling out my winter coats, casual clothes, and the few framed photos I had from my service days. "Get your test tube mistakes out of my son's house," Brenda screamed, her face flushed red as she pointed at me, her finger trembling. "I told Bradley years ago that he shouldn't have married trash from the military. You contribute nothing. No money, no taste, no future. You're a parasite. Now pick up your garbage and get out, or I'm calling the police for trespassing." The babies began to cry, their tiny voices piercing the tense air in reaction to the noise and hostility. It tore at my heart, but despite the burning in my abdomen, I forced myself to stay calm. I looked at Bradley, the man I had sworn my life to, hoping for even a flicker of hesitation or regret as his own mother tried to force his newborns into a blizzard. But he just held Meredith's hand, smirking, sipping his champagne, waiting for me to break. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to cry. He severely underestimated the woman he had married. Brenda stepped forward, a glint of greedy opportunism in her eyes. She wasn't content with just dumping my clothes into the Boston cold. Her gaze locked onto the side pocket of my diaper bag, where a gold chain was peeking out. It was an antique necklace passed down from my grandmother, a family heirloom. Brenda lunged, her manicured fingers diving into the fabric. "I'm taking this for the rent you owe us," she barked, her voice sharp with entitlement. Before my conscious mind fully registered the move, my military training took over. I didn't let go of the infant carrier in my left hand. Instead, my right hand struck with terrifying speed. I caught Brenda's wrist, applying precise pressure to her joint, pinning her arm firmly against the cold granite of the kitchen island. Brenda gasped in pain, her knees buckling as the downward pressure pinned her in place. Meredith stumbled back, nearly dropping her champagne glass. The smug superiority vanished from her face. Bradley froze, unable to comprehend how the weak spouse he had belittled for years had neutralized his mother in a single second. I leaned in close, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Never touch my family heirlooms," I told her, making sure she felt the steel in my grip. "And never lay a hand on my children again." I released her wrist, and Brenda stumbled backward, clutching her arm and whimpering like a wounded animal. Bradley quickly regained his bravado, stepping in front of Meredith to protect his new prize. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit pocket and held it up to show me. "Think you're tough because you have a military background?" he sneered, tapping the screen with an exaggerated gesture. "Let's see how far your combat training gets you in the real world. I just canceled our joint credit cards. All your access is gone. Good luck paying for a cab in a blizzard, you freeloading parasite." He locked his phone and shoved it back into his pocket. "Let's see how you survive with zero funds. Now take your trash and get out of my house." I didn't waste my breath arguing. I adjusted the weight of the infant carrier, turned my back on them, and walked straight to the front door. I pulled it open, and the freezing winter air whipped my face like a lash. I stepped out into the howling wind, and the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, locking me out of the warmth forever. The cold was immediate and punishing. The wind was blinding, swirling chaos under the dim streetlights. My boots sank deep into the thick, fresh snow, making every step a battle. I used my body to shield the carrier, leaning forward to block the biting wind from my sleeping twins. Every step on the icy driveway sent a searing, hot pain through my surgical incision, but I didn't stop. I reached the edge of the sidewalk. The street was empty, completely buried under a fresh blanket of white. I had no house keys, no credit cards, but my brain was already moving, calculating logistics, planning the strategic move that would completely dismantle their lives. Before I could reach into my coat pocket to call my emergency extraction team, a pair of bright headlights pierced the whiteout. A sleek, heavily armored black SUV rolled steadily down the street, its specialized winter tires gripping the ice with precision. It came to a smooth stop in front of me. The hazard lights blinked once. The heavy driver's side door pushed against the wind. Elijah stepped out into the storm. My 36-year-old brother-in-law was a sharp and brilliant man. He was married to Bradley's sister, Peggy, and I knew he had always despised the toxic, arrogant culture of his wife's family. He didn't ask if I was okay, and he didn't waste time expressing shock at finding me in a blizzard with newborns. His actions were dictated by absolute purpose. Elijah immediately took off his heavy cashmere coat. He stepped forward and draped the thick, warm garment directly over the carriers, completely insulating my babies from the freezing elements. Without a word, he took the weight of one carrier from my aching arm, his grip firm and reassuring. "Get in the car," he commanded, his voice cutting clearly through the whistling wind. He opened the heated back door of the SUV and I climbed into the plush leather interior. The sudden rush of warm air was a shock to my frozen skin. Elijah carefully secured both infant seats in the back, ensuring the twins were perfectly safe before slamming the heavy door shut. He climbed into the driver's seat, shifted into gear, and hit the gas. The SUV tore through the snowdrifts, leaving Bradley's house far behind in the rearview mirror. The cabin was soundproof, turning the raging blizzard outside into a faint whisper. I let out a shaky breath, letting the adrenaline fade enough so I could think clearly. Elijah leaned over to the center console and handed me a travel mug of steaming black coffee. The heat penetrated my frozen fingers. I took a sip, the bitter caffeine sharpening my senses. Then, he reached over to the passenger seat, picked up a thick leather folder, and handed it to me. I took the folder, my eyes immediately drawn to the gold foil logo embossed on the cover. It was the Vanguard Tech corporate seal, the company where Bradley worked, and Meredith gave orders as VP. The papers inside were dense with financial data, highlighted routing numbers, and flagged wire transfer records. It was a roadmap of corporate theft. It was the exact ammunition I needed. I looked up and met Elijah's eyes in the rearview mirror. "They think they won," I said softly, my voice barely breaking the quiet of the cabin. "They think they took everything from me." Elijah shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the snow-covered road ahead. "They have no idea who they just declared war on." His gloved hand tapped the steering wheel. "I'm a senior financial auditor for Vanguard Tech," Elijah said, his tone low and steady against the hum of the engine. "Bradley and my lovely wife think I just sit in a cubicle crunching numbers, closing my eyes while they line their pockets. They think you're a nobody. They think you're just a charity case dragging their precious brother down." He smiled, a sharp, cold expression that promised absolute destruction for those we had left behind. "But I know the truth, Caroline. I've seen the transfer routing numbers. I've seen the encrypted offshore acquisitions made through shell companies. I know exactly what kind of empire you've been building on that laptop for the last 5 years." As Elijah drove the car into the underground garage of the tallest glass skyscraper in the financial district, the armored SUV's tires gripped the concrete ramp. We bypassed visitor parking and pulled straight into a high-security private bay. 2 security guards in tailored suits and armed earpieces nodded to Elijah and immediately opened the heavy doors for us. Compared to the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the garage, the blizzard raging above felt like another dimension. I carried the twins. Their small bodies were warm, completely undisturbed by the chaos we had just left. Elijah swiped a black keycard on a restricted elevator panel, and we soared to the 40th floor without a single stop. When the steel elevator doors slid open, we walked into a massive penthouse overlooking the snow-covered Boston skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the storm outside, but inside the air was perfect and warm, smelling of cedarwood and expensive leather. This was a corporate safe house, one of several luxury properties owned outright by my firm. Bradley had always assumed my occasional weekend trips were for cheap veteran support retreats. He would never know those trips were actually executive board meetings, and he would certainly never know that I held the deed to this multi-million-dollar penthouse he often pointed at in admiration from the streets below. I placed the infant carriers on a massive velvet sectional, checked on my sleeping children one more time, and turned my attention back to Elijah. He had taken off his coat and was laying the contents of that thick folder out on the glass coffee table. The fluorescent glow of the city illuminated his tight jaw. Elijah was a man who lived by financial rules, and what he saw before him clearly made him sick. I walked over, looking down at the highlighted routing numbers, forged signatures, and flagged offshore wire records. Bradley had always had an obsessive need for status, but his salary as a middle manager at Vanguard Tech could never support the lavish lifestyle he flaunted to his country club friends. Now the math was clear. Elijah tapped a newly printed bank statement with a heavy fountain pen. Meredith and Bradley aren't just planning a lavish wedding, they're actively draining the lifeblood out of Vanguard Tech to pay for it. In the last 6 months alone, they've siphoned over $4 million. They aren't just filling the hole left by Meredith's massive gambling debts, they're moving the rest into untraceable offshore shell companies. I picked up a ledger, scanning the transaction approval records. There has to be someone on the inside authorizing these transfers and actively masking them with fake vendor invoices and tampered expense reports. I looked at Elijah, realizing this audit must have cost him personally. Peggy is helping them, I stated, not asking a question. Elijah's expression hardened, and he nodded. My own wife, Peggy, is using her senior position in the accounts payable department at Vanguard Tech to launder that stolen money. They think they're untouchable because they control the internal audit. But they forgot that I report directly to the Federal Compliance Committee, not to Meredith. They thought you were just a broken veteran who could be tossed into the cold. They thought I was just a dependent relative who had to keep quiet. They have no idea what is coming for them. I reached into my bag and pulled out the matte black laptop Bradley was always mocking me for staring at. I placed it on the glass table, right next to Elijah's damning evidence. When I opened the lid, the screen didn't show a standard business operating system. Instead, a wall of green code scrolled rapidly down the black screen, executing a military-grade biometric encryption sequence. I placed my thumb on the scanner and looked straight into the camera lens. A retinal scan verified my identity in less than a second. A soft, mechanical synthesized voice came through the speakers. Welcome back, Aegis Global founder and CEO. Security protocols are green. Elijah smiled, a tight, incredibly dangerous smile. For 5 years, I listened to Brenda call me a parasite. I watched Bradley act like a martyr, as if he were giving me a roof over my head. I let Meredith treat me like an uneducated subordinate not worthy of her attention. All the while, I built the logistics and cybersecurity network I established during my intelligence deployments into Aegis Global. The federal defense contracts we held made Vanguard Tech look like a lemonade stand. I wasn't living in Bradley's shadow. I had been paying for his entire life with the crumbs from my dividends, keeping my wealth completely classified to maintain my federal security clearance. I looked at the divorce papers Bradley had thrown at me earlier. Their crisp, white edges mocked the loyalty I had shown him for a decade. He wanted to toss me into the snow and build an empire with the woman who helped him steal. He wanted to claim my children were a mistake while he paraded around with a corporate thief. I tapped a few keys on my laptop, bypassed the external firewall, and pulled up the Aegis Global dashboard of worldwide assets. I didn't need to fight Bradley for alimony in a messy family court. I didn't need to beg for a slice of the house he thought he owned. I initiated the top-level corporate acquisition protocol. My legal team was already on standby, ready to execute my orders. I turned to Elijah, who was waiting for my command with absolute patience. Let them get divorced, Elijah. Let them plan their lavish wedding with stolen money, I said calmly. They want to play corporate tycoon and steal from their own investors? Then we'll just buy Vanguard Tech. 1 week later, the heavy mahogany doors to the most expensive family mediation office in Boston pushed open. I sat motionless at the end of the massive glass conference table, wearing a simple beige sweater and worn-in jeans. The mediator, a serious man with gray hair, sat at the head of the table, organizing a stack of custody and asset division forms. Bradley was the first to stride into the room. He wore a tailored Italian suit worth more than his monthly salary. Meredith followed close behind, her arm wrapped possessively around him. She wore a minimalist white designer dress and was covered in diamond jewelry I knew for a fact was bought with the money they were currently embezzling from Vanguard Tech. They looked nothing like two people there for a serious legal proceeding. They looked like they were walking down the red carpet at a victory celebration. Meredith pulled out a leather chair and sat directly across from me. She placed her $5,000 handbag on the table, making sure the gold logo was facing my direction. Bradley sat next to her and tossed a thin manila folder onto the glass surface. He didn't ask how the twins were doing. He didn't ask how my surgery recovery was going. He just looked at me with absolute contempt. Let's make this quick, Bradley said, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. My time is very valuable, and Meredith has a board meeting at noon. I'm offering you a standard exit compensation agreement, Caroline. You take the meager personal belongings you had when you left, and you sign over full primary custody of the twins to me. The mediator frowned, adjusting his glasses. Mr. Bradley, this is highly unconventional. Your wife just gave birth to your children. Massachusetts courts generally lean toward joint custody, unless there is a significant risk to the children. Meredith let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. There is a significant risk, sir. Look at her. She's a completely unstable, washed-up veteran. She suffers from severe PTSD. She's emotionally volatile. She has zero income. Bradley has been dragging her along as dead weight for years. If she takes those babies, she'll be living in a homeless shelter before the month is out. Bradley nodded solemnly, acting like a concerned citizen rather than a man who had thrown his recovering wife into a blizzard. "It's truly tragic," Bradley said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I tried to help her reintegrate into civilian life, but she just refuses to work. She's been completely unemployed since she retired 5 years ago. She contributes absolutely nothing to society or to our home. I cannot let my children be raised by someone so unstable and useless." I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap. I used the precise tactical breathing techniques I had used in high-risk military operations to control my pulse. I let them build their false narrative. I let them expose their arrogance to their heart's content. Bradley leaned across the table, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You know you can't survive on your own, Caroline. Without my signature, you can't even afford your own car. You begged me to register that junk sedan in my name because your credit is absolute trash. No bank would approve your loan. You have nothing. You are nothing. If you try to fight me, I will reveal your mental instability to the judge and ensure you never see those 2 children again." He smirked, looking at Meredith for validation. She smiled back, patting his hand affectionately. Bradley was entirely correct about the car registration. It was indeed in his name, but he didn't know the truth that he was too arrogant to ever investigate. As the founder and CEO of Aegis Global, managing a multi-billion-dollar international defense network, federal law required me to maintain the highest level of security clearance. That clearance required me to maintain a public profile of absolute zero assets. I couldn't have any property, real estate, or even a simple vehicle registration traced back to my secret civilian identity. I let Bradley register the car in his name because it fit my security protocol perfectly. It fed his massive ego, all while keeping my business empire completely hidden in the shadows. The mediator looked at me with deep pity. He clearly believed their story. He saw a broken, defeated woman about to be crushed by her wealthy, powerful husband. "Mrs. Bradley," the mediator said gently, tapping his legal pad with a pen. "You don't have to agree to these terms today. In fact, given the length of your marriage and your current lack of employment, I strongly suggest you push for spousal support. Legally, you are entitled to substantial alimony to help you get back on your feet." Meredith scoffed, rolling her eyes theatrically. "If she tries to drain Bradley's bank account, we'll drag this out in court for years. We've hired the best firm in the city. We will bury you in legal fees, Caroline, until you're begging us for bus fare. Just sign the papers and walk away with what little dignity you have left." Bradley pushed the separation agreement across the glass table. It stopped right in front of me. The document outlined my total surrender: 0 alimony, the forfeiture of all rights to the house, and the granting of primary custody to him. I stared at the thick stack of papers. I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump forward just enough to mimic a woman who had completely lost hope. I let my breathing hitch, as if I were struggling to hold back tears of absolute despair. I reached into my cheap canvas tote bag and slowly pulled out a plain black ballpoint pen. I looked up at Bradley, my eyes wide, my expression filled with perfect frustration. "I'm just so tired, Bradley," I whispered, my voice trembling at just the right level. "I just want it all to be over." Bradley grinned, a brilliant, predatory smile of absolute victory. "Good girl," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sign on the dotted line and you can go back to being a nobody." I pulled off the cap. I looked completely defeated and broken, but my brain was running 10 steps ahead of them. They thought they were burying me. They had no idea I was about to rewrite the terms of their destruction. I signed the papers and pushed them back. 2 days later, warm light poured onto the polished concrete floors of Beacon Hill Provisions. It was an incredibly upscale, exclusive grocery store where classical music played from hidden speakers and produce was stacked with the precision of architectural art. I stood in the immaculate baby aisle, my hands resting lightly on the handle of my shopping cart. Inside were 6 cans of imported top-tier European baby formula, the exact brand recommended by the pediatrician for the twins. I was wearing a simple black cashmere turtleneck and dark jeans, projecting nothing but quiet anonymity. 48 hours had passed since the brutal mess at the mediation office, and the silent gears of the Aegis Global Acquisition Protocol were already grinding Vanguard tech into dust. I was reaching for the final can of formula when a violent impact nearly knocked the cart from my grip. A heavy metal shopping basket slammed into my hip. I turned, my military training immediately assessing the physical threat. Standing at the end of the aisle, gripping a cart piled high with goods as if it were a weapon, was Brenda. Next to her was Meredith, draped in a floor-length chinchilla coat, carrying a custom alligator skin bag. They looked completely out of place in the quiet grocery store, radiating a loud, aggressive arrogance that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the surrounding aisles. Brenda didn't apologize for the cart collision. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of theatrical disgust. "Look who crawled out of the snowdrifts," she announced, making sure her voice cut through the soft symphony. "I'm surprised security let you through the automatic doors." I guess they couldn't scream at pure garbage. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just placed the last can of formula into my basket and locked eyes with her. Brenda was desperate for an audience, and sensing the sidelong glances from wealthy shoppers browsing the organic produce, she performed even harder. She stepped back and pointed a shaking, dramatic finger straight at my chest. "Everyone watch out for this woman!" Brenda projected her sharp voice, letting it ring through the pristine aisle. "She is an unstable, homeless veteran. She has serious psychological problems, and she's actively trying to steal my son's money. She just abandoned her own children and signed away her rights because she is completely unfit to exist in civilized society. Watch your wallets." A few shoppers stopped, whispering to each other, casting wary glances in my direction. To them, I was exactly what Brenda described: a broken, dangerous drifter causing a scene in their sanctuary of artisanal cheese and imported wine. They expected me to yell. They expected me to break down or defend myself. But I didn't. I kept a perfect, impenetrable blank expression. I let the silence hang, letting Brenda's frantic, echoing voice sit in the air, which only made her look like a complete lunatic. Meredith stepped forward, clearly annoyed that Brenda's theatrics were stealing her spotlight. She placed a manicured hand on Brenda's shoulder, assuming the posture of a wealthy, magnanimous executive dealing with a hick. "Forget about her, Brenda," Meredith said, her tone dripping with vicious condescension. "She's not worth our energy. We have a wedding to plan, and frankly, we're in an entirely different tax bracket now. She can't even touch us." Meredith looked me up and down, her eyes full of venom and unearned superiority. She reached into her alligator skin bag and pulled out a heavy, matte black metal credit card. It was the Vanguard Tech Executive Black Card, the exact account Elijah had shown me, the one they were using to embezzle millions and fund their lavish lifestyle. She held the card up, making sure the light caught the raised silver letters. "You see this, Caroline?" Meredith sneered, waving it a few inches in front of my face. "Bradley and I are closing the biggest deal in business history tomorrow. Vanguard Tech is finalizing a massive merger with an anonymous international defense contractor. Once the ink dries, my shares are going to skyrocket. Bradley and I are about to be billionaires. We're planning on buying a villa in Monaco for our honeymoon, while you're here counting pennies for baby formula." I stared at the black card. Meredith was completely in the dark. She assumed a mysterious, wealthy conglomerate was swooping in to buy Vanguard Tech, and that she was about to be filthy rich. She had no idea the anonymous defense contractor executing the hostile takeover was Aegis Global. She didn't realize that by signing that simple waiver in the mediation office, Bradley had legally forfeited all rights to the empire I had built. I wasn't just buying their company. I was systematically freezing every single corrupt asset they thought they owned. "Congratulations on the merger," I said, my voice eerily calm, wearing a mask of polite, icy indifference. "I hear corporate acquisitions can be incredibly volatile." Meredith scoffed, tossing her perfectly styled hair back. "What do you know about corporate acquisitions? Now get out of our sight or I'll have management throw you out of here." She shoved her cart, brushed past my wheels, and strode toward the VIP checkout lane. Brenda followed right behind her, throwing one last look of absolute triumph in my direction. I took a tactical breath, gave them a 30-second head start, and then leisurely pushed my own cart toward the register. I chose the lane right next to theirs. I stood quietly, placing my infant formula on the conveyor belt, watching as the cashier began scanning Meredith and Brenda's extravagant spoils. They were spending money like they were trying to set it on fire. The cashier scanned pounds of imported Wagyu beef, jars of beluga caviar, artisanal truffles, and 3 cases of vintage Bollinger champagne. It was a sickening display of stolen wealth, clearly purchased for a tasting for their high-end wedding. "That comes to $842.16, the cashier announced politely, bagging the expensive champagne. Meredith flashed her most predatory smile. She turned to make direct eye contact with me, ensuring I was watching her demonstrate limitless wealth. She tapped that heavy, matte black Vanguard Tech corporate card against the sleek payment terminal with a crisp, arrogant click. "Use this black card," she commanded. The cashier swiped the heavy metal card. The terminal processed data at lightning speed. Then, a harsh, discordant beep echoed through the quiet checkout lane. The screen flashed a glaring red. The cashier frowned, looking at the display in confusion. She tried to swipe it again. The machine emitted the same angry rejection sound. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the cashier said, her polite customer service tone stuttering as she looked up at Meredith. "The screen says the transaction was declined. The account is fully frozen due to an active federal fraud alert." Meredith snatched the heavy metal card back from the cashier's hand, as if the payment terminal had physically burned her. A wave of humiliation rushed from her chest up to her neck, turning her flawless complexion a mottled, angry red. "Swipe it again," Meredith ordered, her voice losing its refined, aristocratic polish and turning into a sharp scream. "Your machine is clearly broken. Do you have any idea who I am? That's a corporate black card. It doesn't get declined." The young cashier in the green apron, looking exhausted by this farce, didn't reach for the card. She pointed to the glaring red letters flashing on the display. "I can't swipe it again, ma'am," the cashier said, her tone flat and completely unmoved. "The system has locked the account at the root level. It says, Federal Fraud Alert, confiscate card. I'm supposed to take it, but honestly, I don't want to touch it again. Please move aside." Brenda, who just minutes ago had been desperately raising her volume to ensure the whole store knew I existed, was suddenly taking a deep interest in the nutritional label on a can of organic chickpeas. The wealthy shoppers in the adjacent lane, who had been staring at my worn-out beige sweater just moments ago, now began openly staring at Meredith. In Boston's wealthy circles, throwing a public tantrum over a declined credit card was the ultimate social sin. "I'm not moving!" Meredith shrieked, slamming her alligator skin purse onto the conveyor belt. She whipped her phone out of her pocket, nearly dropping it in her frantic panic. "I'm calling Bradley. I'm calling the bank. Someone is getting fired for this. Vanguard Tech is worth hundreds of millions." I watched her complete meltdown. She was stabbing at her phone screen, her hands shaking violently. She was no longer the untouchable billionaire bride-to-be. She had transformed into a woman standing in front of $800 worth of Wagyu and vintage champagne, only to realize she couldn't pay for any of it. I stepped forward, my movements silent and incredibly precise. I bypassed Meredith entirely, placing my 6 cans of top-tier infant formula on the edge of the belt. I reached into my canvas tote, bypassed my own wallet, and pulled out a crisp new $100 bill. I handed it to the cashier. "Keep the change," I said, my voice projecting a calm authority. "Thank you for your patience." The cashier let out a long sigh, she had clearly been holding her breath, processed my transaction instantly, and handed me the receipt. I packed the formula back into my cart. "Caroline!" Meredith hissed through gritted teeth, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. She stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Don't think this changes anything. This is a bank error, a stupid system glitch." I stopped pushing the cart and turned to face her. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just looked at her with the cold, evaluating gaze of a predator watching prey bleed out. "A federal fraud alert is never a system glitch, Meredith," I said softly, ensuring only she and Brenda could hear. "It's a consequence. Have a lovely wedding." I turned and walked toward the automatic doors, leaving her screaming desperately at a bank customer service representative who couldn't help her. The biting winter air hit me, a refreshing contrast to the suffocating tension in the grocery store. I pushed my cart to the far end of the parking lot, away from civilian vehicles. A heavily armored, all-black SUV was idling near the loading dock. As I approached, the driver's side door opened. Marcus, my head of private security and a former Special Forces teammate, stepped out. He didn't say a word. He just took the cart from me, loaded the formula into the secure trunk, and opened the rear passenger door for me. I climbed into the SUV's massive, soundproof interior. When the heavy door shut with a dull, airtight thud, it instantly cut off the city's roar. I sank into the plush leather seats and let out a long breath. The disguise of the broken, impoverished ex-wife faded, replaced by the tactical mindset of a CEO orchestrating a hostile takeover. Marcus hadn't even pulled the SUV out of the lot before the encrypted satellite phone mounted on the center console began to vibrate. I picked it up and tapped the screen to accept the secure connection. Report! I went straight to the point, skipping all pleasantries. Elias, my COO at Aegis Global, reported with his usual machine gun efficiency. The freeze went off flawlessly, Caroline. Our financial forensics team triggered alerts on all of Vanguard Tech's corporate accounts simultaneously. When Bradley misappropriated company funds to pay for that custom Italian suit this morning, he tripped the final threshold we set with federal regulators. What's his current status? I asked, watching the city streets blur past the window. Total panic, Elias replied. Bradley just realized he's been locked out of everything. Personal accounts, corporate accounts, offshore holding companies. He's currently barking at his legal team, demanding to know why his assets were frozen. But his lawyers can't help him. They're busy reading the separation addendum he signed in the mediation office this morning. I felt a cold smile finally touch the corners of my mouth. Fictitious business terms. Exactly, Elias confirmed, his voice filled with clear satisfaction. By signing that waiver, Bradley completely surrendered his rights to contest any of your financial maneuvers. He legally isolated himself. He thought he was kicking you to the curb, but he actually signed away his right to protect his own company from your asset acquisition. How is the buyout proceeding? I asked, needing the final confirmation. The Vanguard Tech board members are terrified by the sudden federal audit, Elias explained. When they realized their CEO was under investigation for massive embezzlement, they panicked. To save their own pensions, they're desperate to be acquired immediately. They don't care who is buying, they just want out. I leaned back into the leather headrest, the tension finally leaving my shoulders. Give me the final numbers, Elias. Elias took a deep breath, clearly savoring the moment. Caroline, the shell companies have finished their tasks. We just acquired 51% of Vanguard Tech's voting shares. You are officially Meredith and Bradley's boss. 30 days had passed since the grocery store incident. I sat in the back of the armored SUV, the vehicle parked discreetly in the shadows across from my former Beacon Hill mansion. The historic property was lit up like a beacon, casting an aura of invincibility into the cold night air. Valets in crisp white shirts were running around the circular driveway, hurriedly parking lines of imported sports cars and luxury sedans. Bradley and Meredith were hosting a lavish housewarming-cum-engagement party. It was a grotesque display of unearned wealth, funded by a man who in reality had no capital. Elias sat beside me in the darkened cabin, his fingers dancing across the screen of an encrypted tablet. He had bypassed the mansion's smart home security system with ease. Bradley, blinded by his own arrogance, had been too lazy to even change the default admin password I had personally written 3 years ago. High-definition video showed the grand foyer packed with Boston socialites and Vanguard Tech executives, shoulder to shoulder. Waiters in custom vests wove through the crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with overflowing vintage champagne and imported caviar. He really went all out for this performance, Elias noted, his voice colored with professional disgust. Our forensics team confirmed he leveraged the remaining equity in this house to secure a massive high-interest bridge loan just to fund this party and buy that engagement ring. He still believes the frozen company accounts are just a temporary bureaucratic process related to the upcoming merger. I stared at the tablet screen. Bradley was such a total idiot. He really thought his company was merging with a faceless international defense contractor. He had no idea that Aegis Global, my company, was the hidden entity that had quietly swallowed 51% of Vanguard Tech's voting shares. He was throwing a party with money he didn't have to celebrate a business victory that didn't exist. The audio suddenly crackled, pulling my attention back to the screen. Bradley was standing halfway up the grand spiral staircase, elevating himself above the guests to command the room. He tapped a crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The sharp, piercing sound effectively silenced the murmuring crowd below. Meredith stood proudly beside him, wearing a deep V silk gown, a dress that likely cost more than a citizen's annual salary. She held onto his arm tightly, perfectly showcasing the image of a triumphant socialite hostess. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, Bradley announced, his voice filled with arrogant confidence. We are here to celebrate 2 milestone moments. First, my engagement to the beautiful Meredith. She has brought light, luxury, and true elegance back into my life. The crowd erupted in a polite, synchronized applause. Meredith basked in the attention, holding her hand up to show off the diamond ring, which refracted the brilliant light from the antique chandelier overhead. Secondly, "We are celebrating the future," Bradley continued, chest puffed out. "As many of you know, Vanguard Tech is currently finalizing a historic corporate merger. We are partnering with a major international defense contractor, a deal that will launch our firm into the stratosphere and make all our loyal investors incredibly wealthy." He paused dramatically, sipping his champagne in a slow, pretentious manner. His gaze swept over the opulent room, looking at the imported marble statues, velvet curtains, and the lavish floral arrangements filling the foyer. "It's wonderful to be able to breathe freely in this magnificent space," Bradley declared, his tone shifting from celebratory to cruel and mocking. "You have no idea what it cost me to prepare this property for tonight. It took years for me to wash the military grime out of this house and fill it with true taste." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd of sycophants. They chuckled at his cruelty, eager to please the man they thought was about to make them rich. Bradley leaned into it, soaking up their validation. "My ex-wife treated this beautiful historic home like a barracks. Her life followed a rigid, joyless schedule, contributing absolutely nothing to our lifestyle or even to society. She was like a heavy anchor, dragging me into the abyss of mediocrity. But look at us now. The anchor is severed, the house is purged, and we are moving toward a billion-dollar future." I sat motionless in the dark SUV, my expression like an unreadable mask. He genuinely believed the false narrative he had constructed. He believed he was the sole architect of his success, completely unaware that I had laid every single brick of his foundation, or that I was currently pulling out the structural pins one by one. Aegis Global hadn't just acquired Vanguard Tech through secondary shell companies, we had also bought the high-interest bridge loan Bradley had used the mansion to secure. When he missed his first payment 48 hours ago due to the frozen accounts, a hidden clause triggered an immediate asset forfeiture. I glanced at the glowing digital clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 8 p.m. I turned to look at Elias and gave a crisp nod. "Execute final phase." Elias tapped a key on his encrypted laptop. Across the street, the heavy oak front door of the Beacon Hill mansion loomed under the amber porch light. Through the tablet's audio feed, a sharp, undeniable doorbell chime pierced through the classical music and the wealthy gossip. Meredith let out a sharp, shrill laugh that caused the audio levels on the screen to spike. "Oh, it must be the caterers with the second round of beluga caviar," she announced loudly to the executives standing nearby. She patted Bradley's chest affectionately. "Go on, darling, let them in. Tell them to take it straight to the dining room." Bradley handed his empty champagne flute to a passing waiter. He smoothed his tailored suit cuffs, straightened his shoulders, and strode confidently toward the foyer. The security camera tracked his movements as he gripped the polished brass door handle and pulled it open, his face fixed in a brilliant, welcoming smile. That smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Standing on the front porch was not a catering team with silver trays of luxury appetizers. Instead, there was a uniformed county sheriff, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. Beside the sheriff stood a tall woman with sharp features, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and holding a thick leather portfolio. She was Aegis Global's top real estate asset manager. Bradley froze in the doorway, his hand still gripping the brass handle. In the background, the soft classical strings sounded suddenly, absurdly ridiculous against the backdrop of the cruel reality outside. Guests closest to the foyer stopped talking, sensing a sudden sharp shift in the room's atmosphere. "Mr. Bradley," the sheriff said in a low voice, loud enough to carry through the suddenly quiet foyer. "We aren't here for the party." The asset manager stepped forward, wearing a mask of cold, ruthless corporate efficiency. She opened the portfolio and held up a federal court order with a bright red seal. "You are trespassing on private corporate property," she said, her voice effortlessly cutting through the heavy, perfume-filled air of the mansion. "This property is now legally owned by Aegis Global. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate these premises." Bradley snatched the heavy watermarked document from the sheriff's hand. The crisp sound of the paper tearing slightly echoed through the deathly silent foyer. Every guest who could hear held their breath, champagne flutes frozen in mid-air. Bradley scanned the dense legal text quickly, his face turning a deep, dangerous scarlet. "This is a joke," Bradley roared, shoving the paper back toward the sheriff. "A pathetic administrative error. I am Bradley Vance. I am the CEO of Vanguard Tech. I pay the mortgage on this house every month. This is my property." The sheriff didn't flinch. He didn't take the document back. He just rested his hand on his utility belt. "This document is certified by the federal court. Mr. Vance, you are currently trespassing. I suggest you tell your guests to grab their coats." "I'm not telling my guests anything," Bradley barked, his voice hoarse with rising panic. He turned his angry gaze toward the sharp-featured woman in the charcoal suit. "Who the hell are you? Who do you work for? I'll have you fired for this." The asset manager flashed a temperatureless smile, cold enough to freeze the entire harbor. "The name is Sterling. I represent Apex Holdings. And you aren't paying the mortgage, Mr. Vance. In fact, you haven't paid a single cent in over 90 days. Meredith pushed up beside Bradley, her silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. She glared at Ms. Sterling, her diamond engagement ring sparkling under the harsh porch lights, as she crossed her arms defiantly. "That's a complete lie. Bradley is a billionaire. We have millions in liquid assets. He just bought me this custom 5-carat diamond for our engagement." Ms. Sterling looked directly at the ring, her expression completely indifferent to the sparkling rock. "Yes, we are very aware of that ring, Meredith. Our forensics team tracked the wire records. The funds legally designated for the property's third-party escrow account were diverted to a private jeweler in Antwerp. What you are wearing on your left hand is the delinquent mortgage." A collective gasp broke out among the executives and socialites crowding the foyer. Whispers started immediately. People who were praising Meredith's taste 5 minutes ago were now openly dissecting her financial ruin. They whispered about rented furniture, unpaid caterers, and the fake billionaire mask. Bradley whipped his phone out of his pocket, hands shaking violently as he scrolled through his contacts. "I'm calling the bank. I'm calling my wealth manager. I'm wiring the full balance of the mortgage right now, and then I'm going to sue your company into bankruptcy." "You aren't wiring anything," Ms. Sterling said, her voice cleanly severing his frantic rant. "Your personal and corporate accounts have been frozen due to a massive federal investigation into fraud and embezzlement. You have zero liquidity. Your mortgage was legally purchased by Apex Holdings 3 years ago. You defaulted yesterday. The foreclosure is absolute and final." Bradley stared at his phone screen. The red error message from earlier that day at the grocery store remained, glaring back at him. Reality finally shattered his incredible arrogance. He was completely broke. The hallucination had dissolved. Meredith gripped his arm, her manicured nails digging deep into his expensive suit jacket. "Bradley, do something! Write them a check. Call your investors. We're having a housewarming party right now." "There is no party," the sheriff announced, striding into the foyer and signaling the 3 deputies waiting on the porch. "Everyone must leave this residence immediately. Move to the exits. The event is over." Panic broke out among the elite guests. They didn't want to be associated with a federal fraud investigation, and they didn't want to be caught in a humiliating public eviction. Socialites began pushing toward the cloakroom, dumping half-finished crystal champagne glasses onto priceless antique tables. They practically trampled each other to get to the side exit. Bradley stood paralyzed in the center of the chaos, watching his guests flee. "Apex Holdings," he muttered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Who owns Apex Holdings? I'll buy them out. I'll negotiate directly with the owner." Ms. Sterling stepped forward, her heels clicking crisply against the imported Italian marble. She leaned forward, ensuring her voice was just loud enough for Bradley, Meredith, and the lingering guests to hear. "Apex Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of Aegis Global," Ms. Sterling said, delivering the final, fatal blow. "Caroline Vance is the sole owner and CEO. She owns this debt. She owns this equity. She owns this house, and she is demanding you get off her private property immediately." Meredith let out a high-pitched scream and staggered back, as if she had been hit with a physical blow. "Caroline? That timid, pathetic grunt? No, that's impossible. She had nothing when she left here." "She left here with a strategic advantage," Ms. Sterling corrected coldly. "Officers, escort them out." 2 burly deputies flanked Bradley and Meredith. They didn't ask politely. They grabbed Bradley's arms, ignoring his protests in his tailored suit, and pushed him toward the open door. Meredith screamed, fighting the deputy leading her out, her expensive silk gown tangling awkwardly around her legs. "I need to get my things," Meredith screamed, tears of pure rage ruining her designer makeup. "My jewelry, my clothes, my bags are all upstairs." Due to the ongoing federal audit regarding Mr. Vance's embezzlement of funds, all personal property remaining in the residence is currently impounded, Ms. Sterling called out behind them. If you can prove you purchased them with clean money, you can file a petition with the court. Have a wonderful evening. They were roughly pushed onto the front porch. The heavy oak door was pulled shut behind them, completely cutting off the warmth and brilliant light radiating from the mansion they had mistakenly claimed as their kingdom. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, locking tight. As if on cue, the Boston sky cracked open. A freezing, bone-chilling downpour began to assault the city. The icy rain instantly soaked Bradley's tailored suit, plastering his perfectly groomed hair to his forehead. Meredith shivered violently. Her exposed arms and thin silk gown were no match for the biting cold. Her complex hairstyle collapsed into wet, stringy ropes, plastered against her pale face. They stumbled down the front steps, forced to stand on the wet, puddle-filled sidewalk. Behind them, the guests they had tried so desperately to impress were pouring out of the side door, rushing to their valeted cars. These socialites offered no rides. They offered no umbrellas. Instead, they raised their smartphones. The dazzling flash of phone cameras lit up the dark, rain-drenched street. Bradley's elite peers were recording every agonizing moment of his absolute destruction, broadcasting his and Meredith's pathetic eviction to the entire city. A white commercial van screeched to a halt at the curb, splashing water from a freezing puddle onto Meredith's ruined designer heels. Two men in heavy workwear jumped out, carrying electric drills and heavy metal hardware. They jogged past Bradley and Meredith, heading straight for the front door. Bradley stood in the pouring rain, watching helplessly as the locksmiths began drilling the brass lock off the heavy oak door. The high-pitched, piercing sound of the drill echoed through the wealthy street, cutting through the rain. The house he had leveraged his entire non-existent empire to save was locking him out permanently. He was penniless, with nowhere to hide, while his audience of peers recorded his final destruction. The freezing Boston rain dried into a stiff, humiliating crust on Bradley's tailored Italian suit. He had spent the entire night parked in a desolate alley in a rental sports car, listening to Meredith scream until she was hoarse. She cursed him, pounded the dashboard, and finally demanded that he call his parents for help. His parents sent his calls straight to voicemail. By dawn, the reality of his situation had sunk into his marrow like a physical ache. His corporate black card was confiscated. His personal banking app showed a terrifying red zero balance and a fraud alert lock. He had exactly $14 in his wallet. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately before the debt collectors tracked his car. Despair bred delusion. Bradley pulled up an old family location app on his phone, a remnant from when he used to monitor the twins' tablet usage. The location beacon was glowing steadily at the Grand Continental, one of the city's most exclusive, luxurious hotels. A cruel, arrogant smirk broke through his shivering facade. Caroline must be working there. He knew she had zero corporate experience, and her military background was useless. It made perfect sense in his eyes that after he kicked her out, she had been forced to scrub toilets and change sheets just to survive. She was weak, predictable, and desperate for stability. He could exploit that. Bradley left a restless, sleeping Meredith in the passenger seat and strode into the Grand Continental's gilded lobby. His shoes squeaked embarrassingly on the imported marble. He bypassed the concierge desk, slipped into a private elevator behind a wealthy businessman, and hit the button for the top floor. He assumed Caroline would be hiding in a storage closet upstairs or slacking off in an empty suite. The heavy elevator doors slid open to reveal a highly private VIP lounge. The space was breathtaking, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows with a panoramic view of the Boston skyline. Bradley stepped out, his water-stained, wrinkled suit creating a sharp contrast with the velvet furniture and crystal chandeliers. He saw her instantly. Caroline was sitting at a private corner table overlooking the harbor. She wasn't pushing a housekeeping cart. She wasn't wearing a polyester uniform. She was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal-tailored blazer, sitting with flawless posture. A pot of fresh espresso sat beside a leather tablet on her table. Bradley's ego short-circuited his logic. His brain refused to process the reality in front of him. He tried to convince himself she was just sneaking into the lounge to slack off before a supervisor caught her. He smoothed his ruined suit lapels, forced the regretful, charming smile that had won every argument during their marriage, and walked confidently across the room. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down without even asking. He reached out casually, took a fresh almond pastry from the silver tray on her table, and took a bite. Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She simply placed her china cup onto the saucer and looked at him with a gaze so calm it was chilling. "You look terrible, Bradley," Caroline said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "It's been a rough night." Bradley sighed, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the table and play the victim. He lowered his voice, adjusting it to an intimate register to try and manufacture an emotional connection that had been dead for years. "I'm going to be completely honest with you, Caroline. I made a mistake, a massive mistake." Caroline tilted her head slightly, waiting. "It's Meredith," Bradley continued, shaking his head with manufactured exhaustion. "She's completely out of control. The woman is obsessed with money. She's drained my accounts to buy imported marble and blood diamonds. She's unhinged, Caroline. I was stuck in a car with her all night, and all I could think about was how much I missed our quiet life. I missed the stability. I missed the twins." He reached across the table, trying to cover her hand. Caroline moved her hand away smoothly and picked up her espresso cup. Bradley swallowed his irritation and pushed forward, his desperation leaking through his charm. "My corporate accounts are temporarily frozen. Just a bureaucratic error triggered by a massive merger I'm handling. It'll be sorted by Monday. But right now, Meredith is driving me crazy, and I need a place to stay." He put on his most pathetic, pleading expression. "Caroline, Meredith is insane. I miss the twins. Just lend me your veteran disability pension so I can get a hotel room." Caroline didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice. She took a slow, measured sip of her espresso, her black eyes locking onto his panicked face over the rim of the porcelain cup. The silence in the VIP lounge stretched out, heavy and suffocating. "I don't have a veteran pension, Bradley," Caroline said, her voice dropping to a dangerously cold whisper. Before Bradley could process her words, the soft chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the lounge. The brushed steel doors slid open, and the lead forensic accountant for Aegis Global, Elias, stepped onto the plush carpet. He was followed by two men in dark trench coats with federal badges clipped to their belts. Elias held a heavy leather-bound financial ledger. Elias walked straight to their table, his eyes locked on Bradley with the focus of an absolute predator. He slammed the heavy ledger onto the table with a loud, decisive thud that made Bradley jump in his seat. "But you do have a federal indictment," Elias said. Bradley stared at the massive leather ledger as if it were a live bomb. The mask of regret and charm he had carefully crafted melted away, replaced by the pale, twitching reality of an animal cornered. He looked at the ledger, then at the two men in dark coats flanking Elias. The silver federal badges caught the light of the VIP lounge, reflecting the truth Bradley was desperately trying to deny. "What is this?" Bradley demanded, his voice losing its smooth cadence and pitching into a defensive, shrill tone. "Caroline, call off your hounds. This is a private club." Caroline didn't even blink. She took another slow sip of her espresso, her black eyes staring intensely at Bradley over the rim of the cup. She remained completely silent, letting Elias run the show. Elias casually unbuttoned his suit jacket and flipped open the heavy cover of the ledger. The thick parchment was filled with red ink, highlighted routing numbers, and striking financial summaries. He looked at Bradley not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a parasite. "This," Elias said, tapping a densely packed spreadsheet statement with a manicured finger, "is a complete forensic reconstruction of your corporate and personal finances for the last 36 months. As it turns out, when a federal judge freezes your accounts, people start looking very closely at exactly why the pool has run dry." "There were no leaks," Bradley spat, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms, desperately projecting defiance. Despite the air conditioning in the lounge, beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. "Vanguard Tech is in the middle of a massive international merger. My accounts are in a standard compliance freeze. My lawyers will have your license pulled for harassment by Monday morning." "Your lawyers resigned at 4 p.m. today," Elias corrected smoothly. "The moment we provided them with page 42 of this document, they immediately filed a formal motion to withdraw as counsel. It appears they had no idea their expensive retainer was paid with stolen corporate funds." Bradley recoiled. His eyes darted toward the private elevator, calculating the distance, but the federal agents subtly shifted their weight, sealing off any possible escape route. "Let's review the highlights," Elias continued, turning a page with a crisp rustle. "Starting with wire fraud. 8 months ago, Vanguard Tech received Series C funding intended for server expansion and hardware upgrades. Exactly 48 hours after the funds hit the corporate account, you authorized a transfer of $2.4 million to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. That was a legitimate vendor contract, Bradley countered quickly. We were outsourcing proprietary code development. You were outsourcing your lavish lifestyle, Elias fired back, his voice dropping into a harsh, ruthless tone. We pierced the corporate veil of that shell company yesterday morning. The sole beneficiary of that account is your fiancée, Meredith. She used those corporate funds to purchase the blood diamond currently on her left hand, to import custom Italian marble for a house you no longer own, and to fund a series of luxury vacations under the guise of corporate scouting trips. This constitutes corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and international money laundering. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but Elias turned another page, refusing to give him an inch of breathing room. And then there's that bridge loan, Elias said, tapping a brightly highlighted area. You leveraged the remaining equity in the Beacon Hill mansion to secure a short-term, high-interest personal loan to fund tonight's party. But you falsified your asset declaration to the lender. You claimed full ownership of Vanguard Tech's patents, when in fact those patents had already been used as collateral in a previous undisclosed settlement agreement. That is bank fraud, Bradley. That is a major federal crime. The silence in the lounge was absolute. The soft jazz playing through the speakers felt completely disconnected from the total destruction happening at the corner table. Bradley stared at the open ledger, his breathing shallow and erratic. The illusions of his talent, his wealth, and his untouchable status had been mathematically dismantled and bound in that leather book. When a cornered animal realizes it has no way out, it always attacks. Bradley lunged to his feet, knocking his chair backward, sending it crashing to the floor with a loud bang. He slammed his hands onto the table, leaning aggressively toward Elias. The mask of his progressive, sophisticated tech billionaire persona shattered completely, revealing the elitist, arrogant bully he had always been at his core. You think you see through me? Bradley sneered, his face inches from Elias's. You're nothing but a glorified accountant, a pathetic, miserable number-crunching machine that my sister only married out of pity because no one else could stand you. You grew up in a trailer park, Elias. You wear cheap suits and drive a van. You don't belong in this room. You don't belong in my family. And you definitely can't touch me. I'm Bradley Vance. I built an empire. Caroline finally set down her espresso cup. The sharp clink of porcelain against the saucer cut through Bradley's rant like a gunshot. What you built was a house of cards, Caroline said calmly, and you bought the deck with my money. Elias didn't even blink at Bradley's vicious insults. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he defend his marriage to Bradley's sister. He simply looked at the enraged, sweating man before him and offered an icy smile that dropped the temperature in the room. He slammed the heavy ledger shut with definitive finality. You got one thing right, Bradley, Elias said, his tone entirely steady. I am just an accountant. I don't have the authority to arrest you. Bradley let out a harsh, triumphant bark of a laugh, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. Exactly. You're just a paper pusher. You have zero power here. Take your fake book and get out of my sight before I call hotel security. I don't need to touch you, Elias continued, ignoring the interruption completely. He picked up the ledger and handed it directly to the federal agent standing to his left. Because I'm not here to execute an arrest warrant, I'm just here to do the math. And as of this morning, I've delivered this complete and verified audit report to the new majority shareholder of Vanguard Tech. The triumphant sneer on Bradley's face froze. His hand slowly dropped to his side. What are you talking about? Vanguard is merging with an international defense contractor. We're finalizing the equity distribution on Tuesday. There is no merger, Elias stated in a flat, absolute tone. There never was a merger, Bradley. Aegis Global set up that shell company specifically to blind your board of directors. While you were busy stealing money from your own company to buy Meredith diamond necklaces, Aegis Global was quietly buying up every shred of your debt and acquiring 51% of your voting shares. Bradley staggered backward, his leg hitting the overturned chair. He looked from Elias to the federal agent, and finally to Caroline, who sat in perfect stillness, radiating absolute authority. You aren't merging, Bradley, Elias delivered the final fatal blow. You are the target of a hostile takeover. You no longer own your company. You no longer own your house. And as of this morning, you no longer own your freedom either. 72 hours after the news of the hostile takeover of Vanguard Tech went public, the Boston financial district was rife with rumors. But Meredith was never going to let the narrative slip through her manicured fingers. The frozen bank accounts, the eviction notice, and the utter humiliation of being tossed onto the street had initially sent her into a tailspin of hysterical collapse. But Meredith was a survivor of the highest social order. When the truth didn't serve her, she simply invented a new one. She secured a prime guest spot on the Boston Ledger, the city's most popular financial podcast. Sitting in the soundproof studio, Meredith wore a pure white cashmere sweater designed to project innocence and vulnerability, leaning into the microphone. Her eyes shimmered with perfectly timed moisture, holding back the tears she had rehearsed in front of the mirror all morning. "It's a nightmare, David," Meredith said to the host in a precisely calibrated, trembling voice. "Bradley is a visionary. He built Vanguard Tech from the ground up, pouring his heart into developing technology that truly helps people. But now, we are being intimidated by a corporate bully who is using a bottomless pit of illicit funds to conduct a personal vendetta against us." The host leaned in, captivated by the drama. "You're referring to Caroline Vance, the CEO of Aegis Global and Bradley's ex-wife?" "She's not a CEO, David." Meredith chuckled softly, shaking her head as a tear slid perfectly down her cheek. "She's a deranged, incredibly jealous ex-wife who simply cannot accept the fact that Bradley has far surpassed her. Caroline has always been emotionally volatile. She treated their marriage like a military deployment, cold, rigid, and completely lacking warmth. When Bradley finally found happiness with me, something inside her snapped. This hostile takeover isn't business, it's stalking. She is stalking my fiancé out of pure insane resentment, destroying his life's work, and threatening my personal safety." Meredith took an elegant sip of water, letting her accusation hang heavily in the digital airwaves. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a bitter veteran using dark defense contractor money to ruin an innocent tech genius. She conveniently omitted the wire fraud, the forged mortgage documents, and the millions in embezzled corporate funds sitting in her own jewelry box. In the eyes of thousands of listening listeners, Meredith became a tragic heroine, and Caroline became a monster. The podcast aired at dawn. By noon, the manufactured outrage had successfully mobilized the one person in Boston who hated Caroline even more than Meredith did. Bradley's mother, Brenda Vance, had spent the last decade making her disdain for Caroline perfectly clear. Brenda was a woman who valued country club memberships, high society pedigree, and submissive daughters-in-law. She had always viewed Caroline's military service as an act of extreme unladylikeness, and her working-class background as a permanent stain on the Vance family tree. Hearing Meredith's tearful podcast interview was the ultimate validation of Brenda's prejudices. Outraged that her golden boy had been humiliated, Brenda rallied the members of her affluent suburban church group. It was a terror squad of wealthy, self-righteous women who always operated under the guise of moral superiority. Armed with hastily made poster boards and aggressive self-righteousness, the group descended upon the Grand Continental. Brenda was convinced that Caroline was living in the hotel, living a life of luxury on her mysterious money while Bradley suffered. The truth was, Brenda had no idea where Caroline actually lived or worked, but the Grand Continental provided a very compelling stage. The protest was a spectacle of suburban rage. Ladies in designer trench coats and pearl necklaces marched in a tight circle on the sidewalk, blocking the hotel's main entrance. Brenda stood in the center, gripping a battery-powered megaphone with white-knuckled intensity. "Caroline Vance is a predator." Brenda's voice boomed through the megaphone, echoing off the glass facades of the financial district. "She is a corporate bully and an unfit mother. She is intimidating an innocent family. Stop the harassment. Save the twins from this madwoman." The women behind her held their signs higher. They read, "Protect Boston Business," and "Stop the Stalker." Pedestrians slowed down to watch the bizarre performance. Tourists scrambled to take photos of these wealthy women screaming on the sidewalk. Hotel security stood by helplessly, unable to forcibly remove the protesters from public property. Brenda was in her element, weaponizing her maternal rage to protect a son who had actually stolen millions from his own investors. 10 miles away, in an executive boardroom at Aegis Global headquarters, far from the roar of the city streets. The room was a fortress of soundproof glass and dark mahogany. A massive digital display dominated the far wall, currently in split-screen mode. On the left was an audio waveform of Meredith's podcast interview. On the right was live helicopter news footage of Brenda and her church group marching outside the Grand Continental. Marcus, Aegis Global's incredibly protective PR director, paced the boardroom. He was vibrating with professional rage. He slammed a thick legal file onto the polished wood table in front of Caroline. "This is textbook defamation, Caroline," Marcus said, his voice sharp and urgent. "Meredith is explicitly accusing you of stalking on a syndicated platform. Your former mother-in-law is currently slandering your parental fitness on live television. We have a massive team of litigators on retainer. Give me the green light. I'll file a massive defamation suit right now. Before sunset, we can bury Meredith in legal fees and slap Brenda with a gag order before she finishes her next slogan." Caroline didn't even look at the legal file. Her gaze remained locked on the massive display, watching her former mother-in-law scream into the megaphone. Her expression remained completely calm, devoid of the panic or rage that Meredith and Brenda were desperately trying to provoke. She knew exactly what their behavior was: the frantic, uncoordinated thrashing of an enemy whose supply lines had been completely cut off. She picked up her china cup and took a slow, methodical sip of espresso. "No," Caroline said quietly, setting the cup down with a light clack. "We aren't suing them." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at her in disbelief. "Caroline, they're engaging in a massive character assassination. If we don't respond, the public will think Meredith is telling the truth. Let them dig their graves a little deeper," Caroline commanded, her voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling authority. "When an opponent is actively destroying their own credibility, you do not interrupt them. You give them a bigger platform." She turned away from the display and looked directly at Marcus. "Draft a formal invitation with embossed gold leaf. Have a bonded courier deliver it directly to Meredith this afternoon," Caroline instructed. "Invite her as our guest of honor to the Aegis Global Corporate Merger Gala this Friday night." Marcus blinked, his legal brain racing to keep up with her tactical precision. "You want to invite the woman who called you a deranged stalker to our biggest corporate event in a decade? I want her standing in a room full of the city's most powerful investors, wearing the diamonds she stole." Caroline replied, a cold, calculated smile finally creeping across the corners of her mouth. "Let's finish this once and for all." The heavy, rhythmic knocking on Brenda Vance's mahogany front door made Bradley flinch. He was slumped on his mother's floral sofa, wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt he had been wearing for 3 days. Beside him, Meredith was furiously scrolling through social media data on her phone, tracking the engagement of her podcast interview. Brenda marched to the entryway with purpose, flinging the door open, ready to unleash a torrent of suburban housewife rage on whoever interrupted her afternoon rest. Instead, she found a bonded courier standing on the doormat with a silver tray. Resting on the velvet lining was a thick, matte black envelope sealed with silver wax. Brenda snatched the envelope, slammed the door in the courier's face without a word, and brought the heavy parchment back into the living room. "What is that?" Meredith demanded, looking up from her screen. Brenda broke the wax seal and pulled out a heavy card with thick silver edges. Her eyes swept over the elegant, embossed typography. An incredibly arrogant smile spread slowly across her face. She handed the card to Bradley. Bradley read the words aloud, his voice shaking at first, but then suddenly gaining a certain desperate strength. "Aegis Global Corporate Merger Gala, Ritz-Carlton Ballroom, Friday night at 8 o'clock. You are cordially invited to attend as our VIP guest of honor." Meredith practically leaped off the sofa, grabbing the invitation from Bradley's hand to read it for herself. She traced the raised silver lettering with her manicured nails and let out a sharp, breathless, utterly triumphant laugh. "I told you," Meredith gasped, her eyes wide with a manic, delusional energy. "I told you my podcast would work. I told you that protest would force them to back down." "Force who to back down?" Bradley asked, his eyes blinking rapidly as his shattered ego desperately tried to reassemble. Caroline initiated the hostile takeover. Elias submitted the audit. "Bradley, use your head," Meredith snapped, waving the heavy card in front of his face. Caroline is a deranged, emotionally unstable lunatic. She hijacked Aegis Global's resources to satisfy her own personal vendetta. But Aegis Global has a board. They have real investors. You don't honestly think a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor wants a PR disaster, do you? They saw the public outcry. They saw your mother on the news. The real leadership at Aegis Global has stepped in. Brenda clapped her hands, fully endorsing the fantasy. Meredith is exactly right. The little military grunt overplayed her hand. The real executives at Aegis are embarrassed by her behavior. They invited you as VIPs just to apologize. They will finalize the Vanguard Tech merger on your terms, Bradley. Then they'll fire that pathetic accountant, Elias, and throw Caroline out onto the street where she belongs. The delusion acted like an anesthetic. Within seconds, the three of them constructed a completely fictional reality, one in which they were the ultimate victors. The frozen bank accounts, federal indictments, and eviction notices suddenly all became temporary, minor inconveniences. "We have to dress the part," Meredith declared, her eyes narrowing as she mentally inventoried her wardrobe. "If we're walking into the Ritz-Carlton to finalize a multi-million-dollar merger, we can't look like victims. We have to project absolute dominance." That afternoon, the harsh reality of their bankrupt finances collided violently with their desperate need to maintain appearances. Meredith walked into the most exclusive designer boutique on Newbury Street. After selecting a stunning, backless crimson silk gown, she handed her platinum credit card to the sales associate with an expert, nonchalant flick of her wrist. The machine emitted a harsh, flat beep. Declined. Meredith's face burned red as the sales associate shot her a look of undisguised pity. She snatched the card back, claiming it was a bank system error, and tried 3 more cards. Each one was locked solid by the federal freeze. Brenda, seething with humiliation at the register, finally had to pull out her own backup credit card, one specifically reserved for major home repairs. She swiped it aggressively, exhausting every last bit of her remaining credit limit to pay for the $4,000 gown. Bradley didn't fare any better. With his corporate accounts confiscated, he was forced to visit a discount high-end tuxedo rental shop. He spent an hour accusing a teenage employee that the wool blend quality was beneath him, eventually blowing the last $300 of his hidden emergency cash on a tuxedo that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. By Friday night, they had exhausted every single resource they absolutely owned, just to fund this one falsely manufactured night of luxury. A generic economy rideshare car pulled up to the glittering Ritz-Carlton entrance. Meredith stepped onto the curb, her crimson silk gown catching the shimmer of the venue's exterior lighting. She immediately berated the driver for parking too far from the red carpet and refused to pay a tip. Bradley followed close behind, tugging uncomfortably at the collar of his rented tuxedo, while Brenda adjusted her heavy, outdated pearl necklace. They marched toward the entrance of the grand ballroom with a sense of pure, toxic entitlement. The lobby was packed with Boston's financial elite, wealthy investors, and business titans. "Your name?" the hostess asked politely, standing by the velvet ropes with a digital tablet. "Vance," Bradley said, puffing out his chest and lifting his chin. "Bradley Vance, CEO of Vanguard Tech. We're invited VIP guests." The hostess tapped her screen. A trained, perfect professional smile bloomed on her face. "Ah yes, Mr. Vance. We've been expecting you. Right this way." As the velvet stanchion was unhooked, Meredith shot Brenda a triumphant, "I told you so" smirk. They strode past the waiting general guests, heads held high, completely oblivious to the trap they had just willingly walked into. They didn't notice the heavy security presence lingering near the exits. They didn't notice that in this opulent space, there was clearly a total absence of any Vanguard Tech branding. They stepped into the stunning, crystal-lit ballroom, sneering at a waiter who offered them a champagne tray. "Ignore these mercenaries," Meredith whispered to Bradley, her gaze sweeping the room in search of an executive table. "We're going to find the billionaire running this place and take your company back." Meredith led the way, her rented crimson silk gown rustling against the polished marble as they navigated the crowded foyer. Bradley trailed half a step behind, adjusting his stiff, ill-fitting tuxedo collar, while Brenda walked at their flank, scanning the room with hungry eyes. They squeezed past groups of high-profile venture capitalists and influential tech developers, their arrogance blinding them to the confused looks cast their way. In their minds, they weren't bankrupt fraudsters facing federal indictment. They were royalty returning to claim their throne. The Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom had been transformed into a fortress of absolute corporate dominance. Massive ice sculptures carved with the sharp, distinctive Aegis Global crest stood like sentinels near the lavish buffet. Waiters in pristine white jackets moved seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver platters laden with glasses of vintage champagne and imported caviar. The air hummed with the low, refined buzz that comes with wealth and power. The room was packed with the top predators of the financial world, gathered to celebrate the most aggressive, successful corporate takeover in a decade. Bradley scanned the room, his ego working overtime to construct a comforting illusion. He was looking for an older man, a traditional, silver-haired titan of industry. He planned to walk up to this imagined billionaire, play the victim of a rogue forensic accountant, and demand his corporate accounts be reinstated immediately. Meredith was just as focused. Her eyes narrowed as she calculated exactly how to enchant the mysterious Aegis Global CEO to secure her seat on the executive board. Then, Brenda stopped dead in her tracks. Her manicured hand clamped into Bradley's bicep like a pair of pliers. Her face, carefully painted and lifted to present the perfect image of a suburban matron, twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. She pointed a trembling finger toward the center of the room, right in front of the main podium. Caroline was standing there. She wasn't lurking near a service exit. She wasn't wearing a faded polyester uniform, nor was she pushing a housekeeping cart. Caroline was wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored emerald gown that swept the floor. The deep green silk clung to her toned physique with extreme elegance, contrasting sharply with her calm, striking features. The perfectly cut diamonds at her throat and wrists flashed, catching the brilliant radiance of the chandelier above. She looked radiant, imposing, and absolutely untouchable. Caroline wasn't standing alone. She was in earnest, low-voiced conversation with a man Bradley recognized instantly. It was U.S. Senator Thomas Sterling, the most powerful political figure in Massachusetts. The senator was leaning forward, nodding intently at what Caroline was saying, his body language conveying absolute deference and deep respect. Bradley's brain refused to process the image. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Poisoned by years of pathological narcissism and a desperate thirst for superiority, he immediately fabricated a new, comforting lie. He tried to convince himself that Caroline had used her veteran status to manipulate her way past security and was cornering a politician out of pure jealousy, trying to ruin Vanguard Tech's night of victory. Brenda didn't hesitate for a second. Her hatred for her former daughter-in-law overrode the last shred of her social grace. She marched across the crowded dance floor, shoved a waiter aside, and charged straight toward the podium. Bradley and Meredith followed close behind, emboldened by Brenda's shocking sense of entitlement. The refined hum of the ballroom was shattered by Brenda's sharp, abrasive voice. "Security!" Brenda screamed, waving her arms frantically to get the attention of the men in black suits lining the perimeter. "Security! Who let this homeless veteran in? She's stalking my son!" Her scream was so loud, the phrasing so vulgar, that everyone turned in unison. The ambient noise in the room was choked off with extreme cruelty. Wealthy investors, corporate executives, and international dignitaries stopped mid-sentence. Champagne flutes hung in mid-air. Hundreds of eyes turned to watch the bizarre, aggressive spectacle unfolding near the stage. Carolyn turned her head slowly. She didn't look startled. She didn't look afraid. She just watched Brenda with the serene, detached calm of a predator watching a severely wounded animal stumble into a trap. Meredith, desperate to establish dominance and hold her place among the financial elite, eagerly pushed in front of Brenda. She put a hand on her hip, looking Caroline up and down with a mocking, pitying stance. She intentionally raised her volume, ensuring every powerful investor in the room could hear her. "Did you sneak in to steal the appetizers, Caroline?" Meredith laughed loudly. In the sudden silence of the ballroom, the laugh sounded jarring, ugly, and desperately hollow. "Get out before I have the police arrest you. You're making a fool of yourself." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and terrifying. It wasn't the silence of a crowd watching an embarrassing party crasher get caught. It was the silence of hundreds of highly influential, extremely intelligent people watching three completely clueless fools commit spectacular social and professional suicide on a public stage. Senator Sterling looked at Caroline with eyes devoid of pity or confusion. He turned his gaze slowly toward Meredith, eyes narrowing into slits, glaring at her with icy, intense disgust. He looked at her as if she were a toxic insect that had just crawled onto his shoe. From the shadows of the room, the head of security approached. He was a burly, broad-shouldered man with an inconspicuous earpiece, moving with a quick, decisive stride. Bradley crossed his arms, smirking, heels lifted, waiting eagerly for this brawny man to grab Caroline's arm and drag her out through the service door. The head of security walked right past Bradley without even glancing at him. He stopped directly in front of Caroline and bowed his head with extreme deference. The lights from the massive crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed suddenly, fading into a dramatic, low-key ambient glow. The sudden change in lighting completely neutralized Brenda's demands for security. The brawny security chief, who had just bowed respectfully to Caroline, retreated seamlessly back into the shadows surrounding the ballroom without a word. Senator Sterling offered Caroline a warm, respectful smile, touched her arm lightly, and stepped back into the crowd, leaving her alone in her striking emerald gown. Bradley tugged frantically at his tight tuxedo collar, a cold sweat seeping from his shoulder blades. His arrogant certainty began to crack. Things were completely wrong. The security team had ignored his mother. A U.S. senator was glaring at his fiancée with extreme disgust. The room full of wealthy investors was watching them, not with admiration, but with a mix of extreme annoyance and clinical pity. Meredith, completely unaware of the shifting power dynamics, leaned into Bradley and pinched his bicep. She whispered excitedly that the speech was about to start, that the real CEO was about to come out and welcome them to the executive board personally. Brenda desperately smoothed the front of her outdated gown, chin up, trying to radiate an air of absurd superiority, convinced her VIP status was about to be validated. A smooth voice, perfectly amplified by the sound system, echoed through the space, demanding absolute attention. A distinguished MC walked to the acrylic podium in the center of the main stage. He adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of Boston's financial elite. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and respected corporate partners," the MC began, his voice ringing with trained deference. "Tonight marks a monumental shift in the international technology sector. Over the past 5 years, Aegis Global has been operating in the shadows, quietly building a multi-billion-dollar portfolio spanning defense contracts, cybersecurity infrastructure, and advanced data analytics. Tonight, Aegis Global steps firmly into the spotlight. A ripple of excited whispers moved through the wealthy crowd. Bradley felt his chest tighten with anticipation. The sheer scale of Aegis Global was staggering. If they really were acquiring Vanguard tech, he expected a massive, immediate payout to clear his legal troubles. He waited eagerly for his name to be called. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the most aggressive, successful corporate takeover in a decade," the MC continued, gesturing grandly toward the center of the room. "Please join me in welcoming the visionary architect behind this historic acquisition. She is a decorated veteran, a brilliant corporate strategist, the founder and CEO of Aegis Global, and the new absolute majority owner of Vanguard Tech." The MC raised his hand, beaming, "Ms. Caroline Vance." With a crisp, mechanical click, a blinding, pure white spotlight snapped on. It didn't sweep toward the grand staircase, nor toward the VIP double doors at the back of the hall. It descended directly from the ceiling, vertical as a lightning bolt. The dazzling circle of light illuminated Caroline. She stood motionless, the emerald silk of her custom gown shimmering under the glare. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a queen who had finally ascended her throne. Bradley's brain suffered a catastrophic failure. The cognitive dissonance of hearing his ex-wife introduced as a billionaire business titan short-circuited his nervous system. All the blood drained from his face instantly. The muscles in his right arm went completely slack. A crystal champagne flute slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the polished marble floor. It broke into thousands of glittering shards, the sharp crashing sound echoing in the deathly silent ballroom. Bradley stared at Caroline, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. The undeniable, terrifying reality smashed into him, crushing the last remnants of his delusions. Caroline was the anonymous buyer. Caroline was the entity executing the hostile takeover. Caroline was the one who had deployed the forensic accountants. Caroline owned everything. Meredith stared into the center of the spotlight. Her carefully applied makeup suddenly looked like a clown mask painted onto her sickly pale skin. Her breath caught in her throat, producing a pathetic, choking gasp. The arrogance that supported her entire existence evaporated in a microsecond. Just this morning she had called the Aegis Global CEO a deranged stalker on a syndicated podcast. She had just screamed at her in front of a U.S. senator. She had just demanded the hotel owner throw her into the street. Meredith's knees gave out. She grabbed Bradley's rented tuxedo jacket frantically, trying to stop herself from collapsing, but Bradley offered no support. He was completely paralyzed, staring blankly ahead. Brenda experienced a total systemic collapse. The woman she had tormented, belittled, and viewed as working-class trash was standing in the spotlight, having earned the respect of the most powerful people in the state. Brenda let out a deeply suppressed, gasping cry of absolute denial. To escape the suffocating humiliation radiating from the crowd, she took a blind, panicked step backward. Her high heels tripped on the thick linen tablecloth of a nearby catering service table. She stumbled back, hitting the table hard. A tower of silver platters and crystal appetizer dishes collapsed onto the floor with a deafening crash. No one rushed to help Brenda. The wealthy elite realized the toxicity of the three, and with perfect unison, took a collective step back, leaving Bradley, Meredith, and Brenda completely isolated in the center of a massive circle of public shame. They looked like terrified intruders trapped in a place where they didn't belong, standing amidst broken glass and spilled food. Caroline didn't spare them a single look of pity. She began to walk forward. She moved with effortless grace and lethal precision, like a commander inspecting newly conquered territory. The crowd parted for her, breaking into spontaneous, respectful applause as she glided past them. She walked up the short steps to the stage, her posture flawless, her presence demanding absolute submission from everyone. As she reached the podium, the applause died down, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Caroline placed her hands gently on the edge of the acrylic stand. She looked out over the ballroom, acknowledging the investors and executives. Then, slowly and with extreme deliberation, she lowered her gaze. She looked past the wealthy socialites, locking her deep, unwavering eyes onto the trembling, utterly ruined trio on the floor below. Her gaze pinned Meredith in place, like a butterfly on a mounting board. Caroline leaned slightly toward the microphone. Her voice was smooth, cold, and amplified to perfection by the sound system. "Welcome to my company, Meredith," Caroline stated, each word cutting through the silence like a freshly sharpened blade. "Let's discuss your performance review." As if signaled by her movement, the massive, ornate oak doors at the back of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. The crowd of wealthy investors parted instantly, clearing a wide, unobstructed path through the center of the room. Elias, the new CFO of Aegis Global, strode into the ballroom. He wasn't wearing his usual nondescript accounting cardigan. He wore an incredibly sharp, perfectly tailored black suit, his expression completely unreadable. Guarding his flanks with tactical precision were 6 FBI agents. The gold badges on their dark jackets glinted under the lights. They marched straight down the aisle, their eyes locked on the weeping man on the floor and the woman paralyzed in her crimson gown. The synchronized footsteps of the 6 federal agents echoed like a death knell against the marble floor. Elias stopped a few paces away, his posture relaxed, hands neatly clasped behind his back. He watched the scene with the clinical satisfaction of an accountant whose books have finally balanced to the penny. The lead FBI agent walked directly to Bradley, who remained on his knees in the broken glass, paralyzed by the reality of his own destruction. The agent didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute that his words reached the furthest corners of the room. "Bradley Vance and Meredith Hayes, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." Before Bradley could even process the words, 2 agents hauled him up. They spun him around and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking cut through the room. Meredith let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek of pure terror. She tried to scramble backward on the polished floor, the heavy, rented crimson silk designer gown tangling awkwardly around her legs. An agent grabbed her arm, lifting her up effortlessly. Her wrists were cuffed just as quickly. The shimmering diamond bracelet she'd bought with stolen Vanguard tech money clattered harshly against the cold steel of the federal shackles. Boston's financial elite watched the spectacle with a mix of morbid fascination and utter disgust. These were the city's power brokers, ruthless protectors of their own wealth and reputation. Seeing 2 blatant fraudsters hauled away in chains was a brutal reminder of the consequences of crossing the line. Venture capitalists, senators, and socialites, they all retreated in perfect unison, clearing a wide channel of shame for the prisoners. Seeing her golden boy in handcuffs finally shattered Brenda completely. Her delusions of grandeur, decades of indulging Bradley's worst impulses, and her ruthless cruelty toward Caroline, all of it crumbled in that single instant. She let out a sickening, agonizing wail that didn't sound human. Brenda collapsed onto the floor, her outdated skirt hiking up awkwardly as she scrambled on her hands and knees toward the stage. "Caroline!" Brenda sobbed, her voice hoarse and broken. She reached out, her fingers clawing at the base of the acrylic podium. "Caroline, please, you have to stop this. You're a billionaire. You have lawyers. You can fix this. He's your family. He's my son. Please, I beg you, give me the money to pay for his defense. You owe him at least that." Caroline looked down at the woman who had spent years making her life a living hell. She thought of the insults about her background, the relentless criticism of her ambition, and the pure joy Brenda had shown when Caroline was thrown to the curb. Caroline felt no rage. She felt no pity. She felt absolutely nothing. "I only owe him what he earned himself," Caroline stated, her voice hard and polished like a diamond. She looked at the pathetic, weeping woman still clawing at the stage. "Take your trash and get out of my ballroom." The brawny security chief emerged from the shadows, stepping forward with two equally formidable guards. He clamped a hand firmly onto Brenda's shoulder and dragged her up without ceremony. Brenda struggled and wailed, her makeup running in thick black rivers down her face, but she was powerless. The FBI agents marched Bradley and Meredith down the wide, empty aisle the crowd had surrendered. Bradley kept his head down, tears dripping from his chin, his arrogance evaporated. Meredith sobbed hysterically, pleading with anyone who would make eye contact, but the billionaires simply turned away as she passed. Security hauled Brenda right behind them. She reached out to her wealthy acquaintances, the very people she had spent all night desperately trying to impress, but they ignored her, as if she were a transparent person made of glass. This was the ultimate social exile. The heavy oak doors at the back of the Ritz-Carlton slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate and silencing Brenda's wails forever. The ballroom collectively exhaled. A low hum of genuine awe began to ripple through the crowd. They turned back toward the stage, looking at Caroline with a new, incredibly deep sense of respect and fear. She hadn't just fought off a hostile takeover, she had annihilated her enemies on a public stage in a masterclass of corporate revenge. Elias straightened his suit jacket and walked calmly up the short steps to the stage. The murmurs quieted as the brilliant COO approached the podium. He didn't speak into the microphone. He simply walked to Caroline's side, reached into his leather briefcase, and pulled out a single sheet of paper with a heavy, embossed seal. He handed it to her with a faint, knowing smile. Caroline took the document, her fingers tracing the heavy, embossed seal of the Massachusetts family court. She didn't open it for the crowd to see. This wasn't a corporate ledger for public consumption or a federal indictment. It was a deeply private, quiet, and absolute victory. Her black eyes fell on the hurried, jagged signature at the bottom, Paige Vance. Paige had treated Elias like a human ATM, a boring accessory to fund her lavish lifestyle, much the same way Bradley had once treated Caroline. But when Elias handed over the forensic audit to federal authorities, he hadn't just exposed Bradley and Meredith. He had meticulously traced the offshore accounts Paige had used to siphon her own share of the embezzled corporate funds. Facing immediate federal indictment for conspiracy and accessory to wire fraud, Paige's suffocating arrogance had collapsed. Terrified of federal prison, she had signed the divorce papers unconditionally, waiving all claims to Elias's assets, pension, and future. Elias was completely, legally, and financially free. Caroline looked up from the fresh ink and met Elias's gaze. For years, they had both existed as invisible ghosts in the background of the Vance family's delusional theater. They were the punchlines, the outcasts, the socially unacceptable dead ends, the baggage that dragged down the family's imagined greatness. Now, they were the executioners. Caroline stepped back to the acrylic podium and adjusted the microphone. The ballroom, still reeling from the violent spectacle of federal arrests and Brenda's pathetic eviction, fell into a breathless silence. The city's financial elite leaned in, desperate to align themselves with the new apex predator in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caroline's voice was loud, warm, and authoritative, a sharp contrast to the icy tone she had used to dismantle her ex-husband. A corporate acquisition of this scale requires more than just capital. It requires absolute operational integrity. It requires a leadership team that cannot be bought, cannot be intimidated, and will never compromise. Aegis Global didn't achieve its current market dominance by rewarding mediocrity, and we will not allow Vanguard Tech to wither away in the ruins of the previous management. Myris and Sarai, she gestured elegantly toward the man standing beside her in his perfect black suit. The forensic deconstruction of Vanguard Tech was no simple task. It required a mind capable of unraveling years of intentionally obfuscated financial records. It required talent, precision, and an unshakable moral compass. The man beside me possesses all three in abundance. Elias stood tall, his posture no longer slumped by his ex-wife's constant belittling. The brilliant accountant had stepped out of the shadows permanently. Effective immediately, Caroline announced, the ballroom's perfect acoustics carrying her words to the furthest velvet-covered corners. Vanguard Tech is officially a subsidiary of Aegis Global, and as my second act as majority owner, it is my extreme honor to introduce the man who will lead its total financial restructuring. Please welcome the new CFO of Vanguard Tech, Mr. Elias Sterling. The applause started in the front row, led by Senator Sterling, and cascaded like a waterfall through the entire Ritz-Carlton ballroom. It was deafening. Venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and angel investors clapped with manic intensity, instantly recognizing the brilliance of the strategic move. Caroline hadn't just cleared out the corruption at Vanguard Tech, she had installed a financial genius at the helm to rebuild it. Amidst the roaring standing ovation, Caroline turned to Elias. She extended her right hand. Elias met her with a firm, confident handshake. It was a simple professional gesture, but the unspoken weight behind it was immense. It was a covenant between two survivors. Two outsiders who had been systematically treated as worthless, discarded by a family built on narcissism and deceit, were now the undisputed rulers of this empire. They had won. The toxic machinery of their past had been dismantled, replaced by an enterprise built entirely on their own merit. Caroline gave him a sincere, approving nod and stepped back, letting Elias bask in the applause that was entirely his own. The MC stepped forward to take the podium, signaling that the gala was moving into the celebratory phase. The heavy lifting was done. The boardroom was clean. Caroline turned away from the stage. She walked down the short stairs and began her final journey across the ballroom. The crowd parted for her again, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Gone were the whispered gossip and the condescending stares. Boston's elite bowed their heads respectfully as she glided past. Venture capitalists shoved trendy business cards into her security team's hands, begging for a sliver of her time. She acknowledged them with polite, microscopic nods, like a queen departing the court, her pace effortless and perfectly elegant. She walked past the shards of Bradley's shattered champagne flute, past the overturned catering table where Brenda had wailed in defeat, and straight through the massive oak double doors. The heavy soundproofing of the Ritz-Carlton lobby swallowed the applause behind her instantly. Escorted by her security team, Caroline pushed through the revolving brass doors of the hotel and stepped out into the night. She paused on the top step, taking a slow, unhurried breath. 7 years ago, she had been kicked out of her home and into a blinding, freezing blizzard, with nothing but a bag of cheap clothes and a broken heart. She had nearly frozen to death in the snow, a victim of her own misplaced loyalty and Bradley's rampant greed. There was no storm tonight. The Boston sky was incredibly calm, breathtakingly clear, with stars burning bright and steady against the vast black backdrop. The air was crisp, carrying the fresh, clean scent of the harbor. A flawless black Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled to a stop with extreme smoothness at the bottom of the red-carpeted steps. Her uniformed driver, a stoic man who had driven for her for 3 years, stepped forward instantly to open the heavy rear door. Caroline didn't look back at the hotel. She smoothed the emerald silk of her gown, stepped into the incredibly luxurious leather interior of her own car, and let the door close gently behind her. The armored door of the Phantom slid shut, sealing Caroline into a soundproof cocoon of flawless leather and polished walnut. The chaotic energy of the Ritz, the flashing lights of federal vehicles, and the lingering echoes of Bradley's pathetic screams were cut off instantly. As the car pulled away from the curb and merged into the quiet Boston night, Caroline poured herself a sparkling water from the chilled center console. She took a slow sip, letting the cold liquid wash away the last vestige of tension from the night. Her heart rate was perfectly steady, no lingering adrenaline, no manic high from the revenge, no shaking hands. just a profound, settling stillness. It was the absolute silence that descends when a massive, outstanding debt has finally been settled, to the penny with interest and paid in full. The city lights blurred past the dark windows, transitioning from the harsh artificial glare of the financial district to the quiet, expansive darkness of the Atlantic coastline. She watched the reflection of the emerald gown on the glass. 7 years ago, she had been tossed out like garbage into a blinding, freezing blizzard, shivering in a thin coat with nothing but a bag of cheap clothes and a broken heart. She had been viewed as a disposable item, a minor inconvenience to be swept aside for Meredith's grand entrance. Tonight, the air outside was crisp, calm, and incredibly clear. The stars burned bright and steady against the vast black backdrop, guiding her way home. The car turned off the coastal main road and slid onto a private, winding lane lined with towering, ancient evergreens. At the end of the 2-mile driveway stood massive wrought iron gates. As the vehicle approached, the gates parted silently. Guarded by the highest-level surveillance technology pioneered by Aegis Global, a 24/7 elite security team stood ready. The coastal estate, bathed in soft architectural lighting, came into view. It was a sprawling, modern masterpiece of imported stone and floor-to-ceiling glass, perched high on a rugged cliff overlooking the ocean. The waves rhythmically pounded the rocks below, like a steady, powerful heartbeat. This was her fortress. She didn't own it because of a marriage. She hadn't inherited it. She had built it brick by brick, dollar by dollar, entirely on her own merit. Caroline stepped out of the car, the cool, salty sea breeze kissing her skin. She walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, past the grand spiral staircase, and the formal living areas. The air inside was perfectly climate-controlled, scented faintly with lavender and sea salt. She walked with purpose down the plush carpeted hallway in the east wing, her silk gown rustling with the softest swish against the floor. She pushed open a heavy white door and stepped into the nursery. The room was a sanctuary, bathed in the soft, warm light of a star projector that mapped quiet constellations onto the ceiling. 2 identical, handcrafted cribs sat in the center of the room. Caroline walked forward silently, her posture finally softening for the first time all night. She looked down at the sleeping twins, a boy and a girl, their tiny chests rising and falling in a perfectly calm, steady rhythm. A surge of intense protectiveness and warmth swelled in her chest. They knew nothing of the empire their mother commanded. They knew nothing of the corporate massacre that had just taken place miles away. Most importantly, they would be perfectly safe, far away from the toxic bloodline she had just severed completely. Bradley would never know them. Brenda could never contaminate them with her narcissistic poison. They would never be treated as outsiders in their own home. They would never be told they were worthless or disposable. They would grow up in absolute safety, massive wealth, and incredibly intense unconditional love. They were the true heirs, not to the bankrupt tech company built on lies and riddled with embezzlement, but to a legacy of pure resilience. Caroline leaned down gently, brushing a soft curl of black hair from her daughter's forehead. Looking at them, she reflected on the true nature of power. Society often confuses power with volume. Meredith had thought power was loud, shrill demands in a hotel lobby. Bradley had thought power was arrogant smirks and rented tuxedos. Brenda had thought power was belittling those beneath her social station. They were all wrong. True power is never loud. It doesn't scream to get attention. True power is absolute silence. It is the discipline to keep your tongue held with extreme cruelty and unshakable discipline when you are insulted. It is the ability to harness your humiliation, swallow your tears, and channel that raw pain into a relentless, invisible drive. Power is building your fortress in the dark, laying every brick with calculated, almost paranoid precision. It is smiling and being gracious to your enemies while you quietly buy the land out from under their feet, waiting patiently until your walls are impregnable, only then finally dropping the drawbridge. And she had learned the absolute truth about family. The people who share your DNA are not automatically your family. Blood means nothing if it is laced with venom and deception. Family is not defined by a marriage certificate or a shared last name that someone tries to use to extort money. Family is defined by actions. Family is the person who hands you a coat when you are freezing to death in a blizzard. Family are the people who stand with you in the trenches, help you audit the unauditable, and build an empire with you in the shadows. She had forged her own family, and it was unbreakable. She stood by the cribs for a long time, watching their gentle rise and fall as they breathed. The ghosts of her past were gone, locked in federal detention, their reputations incinerated, exiled to the fringes of society, the place they belonged all along. The slate had been wiped clean, beautifully. Caroline pressed a light kiss to her fingertips and touched the wooden edge of each crib. She turned and walked out of the nursery, leaving the door slightly ajar. She strode forward into the bright, unwritten future she had fought ruthlessly to secure. Sometimes the trash cleans itself, but occasionally you need to buy the trash company to make sure it happens. Have you ever been underestimated by a partner, only to make them regret it for the rest of their lives? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of survival, prosperity, and conquest. The deepest lesson in these stories is that true value never comes from the approval of a toxic family. For years, these resilient women endured cruel comparisons, blatant favoritism, and heartbreaking exclusion. Yet, instead of succumbing to their assigned roles as the scapegoat, they channeled that pain into a quiet, unstoppable ambition. They built their fortresses of success in absolute silence. When the moment of truth arrived, they didn't need to shout to prove their strength. Their undeniable achievements spoke for themselves. Reclaim your inner power. Break the shackles of toxic expectations and share your journey in the comments below.